This is David Ranson. Welcome to the webcast for the month of May. This is a quarterly webcast, and this particular topic is tariffs, their effect on the economy, with special reference to their effect on the trade deficit. And I'm concerned with the mechanism by which tariffs affect the economy and thereby the trade deficit. And there is an effect on the trade deficit which is easy to show, but it's not at all easy to show what the mechanism is, what the links from one part of the economy to another part. And this is my first attempt really to make sense out of this. The first slide shows the history of the tariff rate in the US. The effective tariff rate is the weighted average of tariffs on different countries, different goods and services, and compared with the imbalance between exports and imports. I'm not showing the trade deficit as such because when the economy was so much smaller back in the 1930s, the difference between exports and imports measured in dollars would look huge. But that distorts the perspective. And to keep the perspective constant, I'm using the ratio between exports and imports. As you see, that has been at times very much more extreme than it is today. But the extreme part of it was really an extraordinarily unusual time just after the Second World War, when the whole world was in pretty much economic chaos, particularly in Europe. You see here the dotted line is the effective tariff rate, and that too was very much higher in the past, especially in the early 1930s, after the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was passed. You see that the effective tariff rate reached a peak around 1932 or 3, and then fell dramatically down to a low level in 1950, partly as a result of the Great Depression, partly because the tariffs were recognized as a mistake. Now we can look at the effect of the ETR on the ratio of exports to imports, which I call XIM. We can see it in this graph, and then we can analyze it statistically. And when you analyze it statistically, I show the results in the next slide, which shows a 3-year time frame for an effect on the trade imbalance to take place as a result of either an increase in the effective tariff rate, that's a green line at the top, or a decline in the red line at the bottom, or no change, which is actually the usual case in the last several decades. And you see clearly that an increase in tariffs increases the ratio of exports to imports. We call that an improved trade imbalance in the first year that it takes place. And that's preserved for a second year, but it has a strong tendency to return to normal in the third year. So the effect of a tariff increase or a tariff decline on the trade imbalance looks as though it's largely temporary. So if we want to bring the economy into it, here are the linkages. We could imagine there are two paths by which, when you impose or take away tariffs, you can affect the trade deficit. You can do it through affecting economic growth. You can do it through affecting inflation, and I'll look at these in some detail. And there are other ways probably in which the mechanism could take place as well. But these are the two that are the natural starting points to look for the linkages. And here is the first attempt to do this. We look at the effect of tariffs on the growth of real GDP, that is output, and also the standard of living, which we can measure roughly by consumer spending, or real consumer spending. And we see here a relationship that's pretty clear, where you have the tariffs increasing in the two bars on the left, and you have tariffs declining in the two bars on the right. Broadly speaking, that's a positive relationship, sorry, a negative relationship, in which the greater the tariff increase, the lower is the growth. And this is not just the growth in output, but it's also the standard of living as well. So we clearly have an inverse relationship between tariffs and growth, which makes a lot of sense since tariffs distort the path of economic activity away from the most efficient places where costs are lowest towards the constrained opportunities where costs are higher. So we can see this diagrammatically in this fashion. Increased tariffs lead to lower output growth or to weaker consumer spending, or both. It's hard to say which is the cause and which is the effect, but the tariffs are causative. It's hard to say whether the change in output affects the consumer spending or vice versa through the demand path or the supply path, but they both lead to a narrower trade deficit. And that's path number one. That's the link from tariffs to growth to trade deficits. If we want to look at path number two, we want to look at US inflation. And here it gets more complicated. Here's a graph showing over a 2-year time frame what a change in the effective tariff rate does to inflation. And you see that the bottom line is the subhistory where you have a relatively large increase in the effective tariff rate, and we get the lowest inflation rates there. At the top, we get a decline of a large decline in the effective tariff rate, and there we get much higher inflation rates. So the imposition of tariffs is deflationary. That's very interesting. It's not intuitive to most people, but this is what the evidence shows if you take the entire time frame from about nearly 100 years ago to the present. Here's another graph that confirms it, although the data here only go back to the 1960s. We can look at the value of the dollar, which is definitely a major impact, a major factor and statistic to reflect the inflation rate. An increase in the tariffs tends to push the value of the dollar up, and therefore, of course, push inflation down, as we saw in the previous chart. So this chart confirms what we saw in the previous chart, and it looks as though the effect goes through the value of the dollar, or is certainly compatible with the change in the value of the dollar. How about the effect on the trade deficit? Well, we can first look at economic growth. And this can be seen so easily in a time series form that I've plotted the data for the last 20 years to show that on a normal basis, there's an inverse relationship. There is 1 year, namely 2020, the year of the pandemic, where the inverse relationship breaks down. But other than that year, the inverse relationship is consistent, and in prior decades as well. So we can argue that a change in real GDP growth has an inverse relationship to the trade deficit, or the change, the trade imbalance, the ratio of exports to imports. So if tariffs have an effect to reduce real GDP growth, that implies they will change, they will improve the ratio of exports to imports, which is the result we saw at the very beginning. So there's not very much mystery about the linkage from tariffs to growth and from growth to the trade deficit. But if once we move to inflation, it does get definitely more complicated. This is the time frame, the maximum time frame we're using, all the way back to 1929, nearly 100 years. And this shows the relationship between the inflation rate and the resulting trade imbalance change. And we find that when inflation accelerates, we get a change in the ratio of exports to imports, which is favorable. And when inflation decelerates, we get an unfavorable effect. Now, putting that together with what we saw just a minute ago, we know that tariffs are deflationary. So we're in the right-hand side, the bar on the right in this diagram. So we should expect the ratio of exports to imports to deteriorate, to become less favorable as a result of deflation. However, it turns out that that is going too far with the data that we've got. All the data here are combined back to 1929. If we divide the data into two different time frames, we get a different answer. Very puzzling, but this is the case. On the left, we get the same answer if we estimate how the trade imbalances are related to inflation in the first half of the time frame, roughly from 1929 to 1977. In the right-hand side, we look at the second half of the time frame, which presumably applies to the present, from 1977 to 2024. And the relationship flips. Deflation shows up as adverse for the trade imbalance in the first half of the period, the first 40 or 50 years, but it's an improvement, although quite a small one, in the second 50 years. And this can be made sense of if we look at the effect of the value of the dollar as well. The value of the dollar never changed. Under the gold standard, we had the value of the dollar not playing any role before the 1960s and 70s, but in the second half of the time frame, it plays a role. So you see here, putting it all together, there's path one, which was straightforward, increased tariffs leading to lower growth and a narrower trade deficit. Path two, more ambiguous, but if we look at the time frame we're in, rather than the time frame that existed back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, then increased tariffs lead to lower inflation and a stronger dollar, and that leads also to a narrower trade deficit. And that is the conclusion so far. It's certainly not a finished story. The next client webcast, which I think will be on another topic, will be offered in August of 2025. Thank you.